May 17th, 1943. Attu Island, Alaska. Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski watched his soldier examine a captured Japanese pistol, small, ugly, with a strange steel bar running along its left side. Private Martinez wrapped his fingers around the frame, thumb naturally falling on that protruding bar. The crack of gunfire split the Arctic air. Martinez stumbled backward, staring at the smoking weapon in disbelief. He had never touched the trigger. Across the Pacific theater, American medics were treating a puzzling epidemic. Marines on Guadalcanal, soldiers in New Guinea, all reporting the same impossible story. Japanese Type 94 pistols firing by themselves. No trigger pull. No mechanical failure. Just unexplained discharges that defied everything Allied ordnance experts understood about firearms. When Captain James Morrison received 3 specimens at Aberdeen Proving Ground, he approached them like any other captured weapon. Standard safety protocols, methodical testing procedures. What he discovered would challenge the most fundamental principle of firearm design. Some weapons kill the enemy, others kill their own users. But Morrison was about to prove that the Japanese had engineered something far more sinister. A pistol that fired exactly when you thought it was safe. The frozen tundra of Attu Island stretched endlessly under the gray May sky, its volcanic soil turned to mud by constant drizzle and the boots of 10,000 American soldiers. Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski pressed his back against the rocky outcropping, feeling the vibrations of incoming mortar rounds through the permafrost. 40 yards ahead, Japanese defenders had carved positions into the hillside with the methodical precision of men who knew they would die there. The Aleutian campaign was supposed to be a sideshow, a quick operation to clear Japanese forces from American soil. Instead, it had become a brutal meat grinder where every yard forward cost blood and every enemy position had to be taken by storm. Kowalski's squad had been advancing for 6 hours, working their way up the slope under covering fire from the 32nd Infantry's mortars. The Japanese had been on Attu for 11 months, enough time to dig tunnels and bunkers that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from naval gunfire. Private Martinez crouched beside him, M1 Garand ready, his young face streaked with mud and exhaustion. At 19, Martinez had joined the Army straight from his family's farm in New Mexico, trading cotton fields for frozen battlefields he could never have imagined. The mortar barrage lifted, and Kowalski heard the sharp whistle that meant their turn to advance. He tapped Martinez on the shoulder and pointed toward a Japanese position 50 yards uphill, a crude bunker built from volcanic rock and driftwood, its firing ports now silent after taking a direct hit from American artillery. They moved in short rushes, using every depression and boulder for cover, while machine gun bullets from other Japanese positions snapped overhead like deadly insects. When they finally reached the bunker, Kowalski found what remained of its defenders. 3 Japanese soldiers lay sprawled behind their weapons, killed by concussion when the mortar round collapsed part of their shelter. The scene was grimly familiar. Young men who had died fighting for ground that ultimately meant nothing to anyone except the generals who moved pins on maps thousands of miles away. But something caught Kowalski's attention that made him pause despite the continuing battle around them. A Japanese officer, identifiable by his slightly better uniform and leather holster, lay crumpled beside a Type 96 light machine gun. Unlike the enlisted men, he carried a sidearm, not the standard Type 14 Nambu that American intelligence bulletins had taught them to recognize, but something different, something smaller and uglier, with sharp edges and a peculiar bulbous receiver that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never held a pistol before. Martinez reached the position seconds later, breathing hard from the climb and the adrenaline of surviving another advance under fire. He immediately began searching the Japanese bodies for intelligence materials, maps, code books, anything that might help the next wave of American troops. But when he spotted the unusual pistol beside the dead officer, curiosity overcame caution. The weapon was clearly different from anything they had encountered before, its crude appearance contrasting sharply with the precision engineering American troops had learned to expect from Japanese equipment. "Hey, Sarge, look at this piece of junk," Martinez said, picking up the weapon and turning it over in his hands. His thumb naturally fell onto a strange steel bar that protruded along the left side of the frame, a design feature unlike anything on American pistols. The metal felt cold even through his thick gloves, and the weapon's balance seemed wrong, as if its center of gravity had been miscalculated during design. The crack of the pistol firing cut through the sounds of distant battle like a thunderclap. Martinez stumbled backward, staring in shock at the smoking weapon in his hands, while a 9mm hole appeared in the volcanic soil 6 inches from his left boot. The bullet had missed his foot by a margin so narrow that he could see where it had torn through the leather of his combat boot's toe cap without penetrating his flesh. "Jesus Christ!" Martinez dropped the pistol as if it had suddenly burst into flames, his hand shaking as the reality of what had almost happened sank in. "I never touched the trigger. I swear to God, Sarge, I never pulled the trigger." Kowalski stared at the smoking weapon lying in the mud, his combat-trained mind trying to process what he had just witnessed. In 3 years of war, from North Africa to Sicily to this frozen wasteland, had handled dozens of captured enemy weapons, German Lugers, Italian Berettas, Japanese rifles and machine guns. All had behaved predictably, following the basic mechanical principles that governed every firearm ever manufactured. Weapons fired when you pulled their triggers. They did not fire when you simply picked them up and examined them. But the evidence lay smoking in the volcanic soil at his feet. Martinez was many things: young, inexperienced, occasionally careless with equipment, but he was not a liar. And Kowalski had watched the entire sequence with his own eyes. The private had picked up the weapon, wrapped his fingers around the grip, and somehow triggered a discharge, without his index finger ever approaching the trigger guard. Something was very wrong with this particular Japanese pistol. This was not just another war trophy to be collected and shipped home as a souvenir. This was something far more dangerous. A weapon that violated the most fundamental rule of firearm safety by firing when it should not have been able to fire. And if one of these defective pistols could nearly kill an American soldier, how many others might be waiting in bunkers and weapons caches across the Pacific theater? Kowalski carefully wrapped the pistol in a piece of canvas, making sure not to touch the mysterious protruding bar that had somehow caused the accidental discharge. This weapon needed to reach American ordnance experts as quickly as possible before more soldiers like Martinez found themselves staring down the barrel of a Japanese pistol that fired itself. Tokyo, Japan, stretched beneath a blanket of industrial smog in the autumn of 1929, its factories and foundries working overtime to supply an increasingly militaristic empire. In a modest office overlooking the Sumida River, 60-year-old Kijiro Nambu bent over his drafting table, sketching the mechanical internals of what would become his most infamous creation. The lamplight cast long shadows across technical drawings that covered every surface of his workspace, each blueprint representing years of painstaking engineering refinement. Outside, the sounds of a nation transforming itself from feudal isolation to modern industrial power filtered through the windows, steam whistles, factory bells, and the constant hammering of construction that never seemed to cease. Nambu had built his reputation on precision engineering that rivaled anything produced in Europe or America. His Type 14 pistol, adopted by the Japanese military in 1925, had earned him comparison to John Moses Browning himself. The weapon's elegant lines and reliable mechanism had made Nambu the most respected firearms designer in Asia, a craftsman whose attention to detail bordered on obsession. Each Type 14 required 47 separate machining operations, with tolerances measured to fractions of millimeters. The pistol's distinctive appearance and flawless function had become symbols of Japanese engineering excellence. But now the military was demanding something different, something smaller, lighter, and above all, cheaper to manufacture. Tank crews complained that the Type 14 was too large for cramped armored vehicles. Pilots argued that its length made it awkward to draw in aircraft cockpits. Most importantly, procurement officers insisted that Japan's expanding military could not afford the Type 14's manufacturing costs, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of units. The message from the Army was clear: design a compact pistol that could be mass-produced at a fraction of the current cost, or watch foreign manufacturers capture Japanese military contracts. Nambu understood the engineering challenge better than anyone. A pistol's mechanism required specific spatial relationships between trigger, sear, firing pin, and magazine. These components had to be arranged within the frame according to mechanical laws that could not be negotiated or compromised. In the Type 14, he had achieved this through an internal sear linkage that ran through the heart of the weapon's frame, connecting trigger to firing mechanism through a series of precisely machined steel components. The system was elegant, safe, and expensive, requiring internal milling operations that added significant cost to each weapon. The Army's new specifications left no room for such refinements. The compact pistol could be no longer than 7.2 inches overall, with a barrel length not exceeding 3.78 inches. More critically, the manufacturing cost had to remain below 75 yen per unit, less than half what the Type 14 cost to produce. These constraints created an engineering puzzle that seemed impossible to solve using conventional design approaches. For months, Nambu struggled with internal arrangements that would accommodate both the size restrictions and cost limitations. Every traditional solution required internal space that the compact frame could not provide, or machining operations that would exceed the budget constraints. His initial designs resembled miniaturized versions of the Type 14, but each prototype proved either too large, too expensive, or mechanically unreliable. The pressure was mounting daily as military procurement officers made increasingly clear that delay was not acceptable. The fatal compromise emerged during late-night design sessions in his cluttered office, as Nambu wrestled with the fundamental problem of sear linkage placement. In conventional pistol design, the sear, the critical component that held the firing pin in position until the trigger was pulled, connected to the trigger through an internal mechanism hidden within the weapon's frame. This internal routing required space and machining complexity that his new design could not accommodate within the specified constraints. Staring at his latest failed prototype, Nambu made the decision that would define his legacy. Instead of routing the sear linkage internally, he would externalize it, running the connecting bar along the outside of the frame's left side. The solution was mechanically sound, saving both internal space and manufacturing complexity. A single steel bar attached to the sear mechanism at one end and extending along the frame's exterior could perform the same function as the complex internal linkages used in conventional designs. The external placement would reduce machining requirements by eliminating the need for internal channels and connecting passages. But Nambu was not naive about the implications of his choice. His engineering notebooks, filled with precise calculations and mechanical diagrams, contained a prophetic observation written in his careful script. External sear placement presents discharge risk during careless handling. He understood that exposing the sear linkage would create vulnerability. Any pressure applied to the external bar could potentially trigger firing without deliberate trigger manipulation. The risk was real, measurable, and completely avoidable through conventional internal design. Yet by 1934, with the Japanese military growing impatient and commercial sales of his earlier designs declining, Nambu submitted the Type 94 design anyway. The Army's evaluation focused on cost, size, and basic functionality, criteria that his new pistol met admirably. The weapon fired reliably, fed ammunition smoothly, and could be manufactured at 68 yen per unit. Most importantly, it satisfied the military's demand for a compact sidearm suitable for vehicle crews and pilots. The Type 94 received official adoption in December 1934, with production beginning at the Nambu Rifle Manufacturing Company's expanded Tokyo facility the following year. Initial orders called for 15,000 units annually, a production rate that required simplified manufacturing processes and relaxed quality standards compared to the precision craftsmanship of the Type 14. By 1937, as Japan's war with China intensified, production had expanded to accommodate military demands that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing month. But even as the first production models rolled off assembly lines, disturbing reports were filtering back from military units. Japanese pilots reported accidental discharges during cockpit operations. Tank crews wounded themselves while maneuvering in confined spaces. Infantry officers shot themselves drawing weapons from holsters. The pattern was consistent and predictable, exactly as Nambu's engineering notes had warned years earlier. By 1939, 71,000 Type 94 pistols were in service or production, each one carrying the same fundamental flaw that its designer had recognized but chosen to ignore. The crisp October air at Aberdeen Proving Ground carried the smell of cordite and machine oil as Captain James Morrison examined the 3 Type 94 specimens that had arrived from General MacArthur's headquarters with unusual urgency. The weapons lay on his steel examination table under bright fluorescent lights, each one tagged with location and circumstances of capture. Serial number 19,847 from Guadalcanal. Serial number 22,112 from Attu Island. Serial number 17,936 from New Guinea. All 3 showed the same peculiar design feature that had caught Morrison's attention immediately: a steel bar running along the left side of the frame, directly exposed to external contact. Morrison had spent the previous evening reviewing incident reports from Pacific Theater commands, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. American troops were accidentally discharging captured Japanese pistols at an alarming rate, always with the same weapon type and always under circumstances that defied conventional firearms safety principles. The reports described soldiers picking up weapons that fired without trigger manipulation, creating wounds and near misses that suggested a fundamental mechanical flaw rather than user error. As Aberdeen's most methodical weapons evaluator, Morrison approached the investigation with the same systematic precision he had applied to capture German Lugers and Italian Berettas over the past 18 months. His assistant, Lieutenant Bobby Chen, prepared the testing apparatus with characteristic attention to detail. The young officer had proven invaluable since arriving from San Francisco 6 months earlier, bringing both mechanical engineering expertise and an intuitive understanding of how weapons behaved under stress. Chen's Chinese-American background also provided cultural perspective that helped Morrison interpret captured documents and design philosophies that might otherwise remain opaque to American investigators. Together, they had developed testing protocols that could isolate mechanical failures and identify safety hazards before weapons reached frontline troops. The first formal test began with specimen 19,847, the Guadalcanal capture that had arrived in excellent condition with matching serial numbers and original leather holster. Morrison loaded a single 8mm Nambu cartridge into the chamber and engaged the safety mechanism according to captured Japanese technical manuals. Using a calibrated spring scale, he applied precise pressure to the exposed sear bar, while Chen recorded measurements and observations in their official testing log. 1 pound of force produced no reaction. The weapon remained stable, its firing pin held securely in position by the sear mechanism. 2 pounds of pressure yielded the same result, with no movement in the internal components visible through the weapon's action. But at 3 pounds of force, the Type 94 discharged with a sharp crack that echoed through the testing facility. The chronograph registered 891 feet per second muzzle velocity, slightly below the cartridge's design specification, but well within lethal parameters for a military sidearm. Morrison examined the spring scale reading with growing concern. 3 pounds of pressure represented less force than required to operate the weapon's trigger, which his preliminary tests had measured at 4.5 pounds. More troubling, 3 pounds was easily within the range of pressure that could be applied accidentally during normal handling, climbing, or equipment manipulation. A soldier grabbing the weapon quickly, setting it down carelessly, or brushing against the exposed sear bar while wearing thick gloves could easily exceed the threshold for accidental discharge. The second specimen required only 2.8 pounds of pressure to fire, while the third discharged at 3.2 pounds. The consistency was remarkable and disturbing. Each weapon exhibited the same fundamental vulnerability within a narrow range of applied force. Morrison calculated that the average pressure required was 2.97 pounds, with a standard deviation of only 0.17 pounds. Such consistency suggested that the flaw was inherent to the design rather than a manufacturing defect affecting individual weapons. But the most shocking results came during what Morrison termed field handling simulations, tests designed to replicate realistic combat scenarios where soldiers might encounter captured weapons. He simulated drawing the pistol from various holster positions, finding that the Type 94 discharged during extraction if the holster applied pressure to the sear bar. Setting the weapon on uneven surfaces triggered firing if the supporting surface contacted the exposed mechanism. Even passing the weapon from one person to another could result in discharge if the recipient's grip inadvertently compressed the fatal steel bar. Chen shook his head in amazement as they completed the 50th test. "Captain, I've analyzed dozens of captured weapons, and I've never encountered anything like this. The Germans, Italians, even the Japanese Type 14, they all follow basic safety principles, but this thing seems designed to shoot anyone who handles it incorrectly." Morrison nodded grimly as he reviewed their accumulated data. 89 successful discharges out of 97 handling scenarios represented a failure rate that exceeded anything in his experience. American service pistols like the Colt 1911 required deliberate trigger manipulation and proper grip engagement to fire. Even damaged or poorly maintained weapons rarely discharged without clear mechanical failure that would be obvious to any trained operator. The Type 94 violated fundamental assumptions about how firearms should behave in the hands of competent users. The implications extended far beyond academic interest in foreign weapon design. Across the Pacific Theater, American soldiers were collecting Japanese weapons as souvenirs, functional equipment, and intelligence materials. If Type 94 pistols were present in significant numbers, and preliminary intelligence suggested production in the tens of thousands, then American troops were unknowingly handling weapons that could kill them through simple mishandling. The accident on Attu Island was not an isolated incident, but the predictable result of a design flaw that made safe handling virtually impossible. Morrison picked up his telephone and placed a priority call to Colonel Anderson's office. The test results demanded immediate distribution to Pacific Theater commands, but they also raised troubling questions about Japanese engineering practices and military procurement standards. How had a weapon this fundamentally flawed entered mass production? Did Japanese troops face the same hazards, or were American soldiers uniquely vulnerable due to unfamiliarity with the weapon's lethal quirks? As he waited for the connection, Morrison stared at the three specimens that had revealed their deadly secret under systematic analysis. Each pistol represented thousands of similar weapons scattered across battlefields from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, waiting to kill unwary American soldiers who assumed that captured equipment would behave according to rational engineering principles. The numbers were clear, undeniable, and terrifying in their implications for ongoing Pacific operations. The humid air of Bougainville hung heavy with the stench of cordite and rotting vegetation as Marine Corpsman Dave Williams treated his third Type 94 casualty in as many weeks. Lieutenant Peterson lay on the improvised stretcher, his left foot wrapped in blood-soaked bandages while Williams worked to stop the bleeding from what should have been a completely preventable wound. The young officer had been examining a captured Japanese pistol when it discharged without warning, sending an 8mm bullet through his boot and into the volcanic soil, barely missing major arteries that would have cost him his foot or his life. Williams had seen enough combat wounds to recognize the difference between enemy fire and accidents, and this pattern was becoming disturbingly familiar. Always the same small, ugly pistol with the protruding steel bar along its left side. Always the same story of mysterious discharge with no trigger manipulation. Always the same wound placement consistent with the weapon being held in examination position when it fired. The corpsman had started warning every Marine he encountered to avoid the Japanese sidearms entirely, but curiosity and souvenir hunting remained stronger than caution among troops who had survived months of brutal Pacific fighting. "Doc, I swear on my mother's grave, I never touched that trigger," Peterson insisted through gritted teeth as Williams tightened the field dressing. "I was just looking at the serial numbers on the frame. The damn thing went off like it had a mind of its own." Williams had heard identical protestations from the two previous casualties, and his medical training told him to believe the evidence rather than assume user error. Combat veterans did not survive months of jungle warfare by being careless with firearms. These men understood weapon safety with the instinctive precision that kept them alive in situations where mistakes meant death. Yet all three had been wounded by the same type of captured weapon under circumstances that defied explanation. 800 miles south in Australia, intelligence officers were conducting systematic interviews with captured Japanese personnel, and the stories they collected painted an even more disturbing picture. Master Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Army's 18th Division, sat in the interrogation room at Brisbane with the resigned dignity of a professional soldier who had accepted defeat. His English was limited, but his technical knowledge of Japanese military equipment proved extensive and disturbingly candid about weapons that had failed his own troops. Type 94, very dangerous weapon, Yamamoto explained through the interpreter, his weathered hand sketching the pistol's distinctive outline on the wooden table. "All soldiers afraid. We call it Widowmaker, not for enemy, but for us. Many accidents in my unit. Private Sato shot his foot during morning inspection. Corporal Ishida fired his weapon while adjusting holster. Worst was Lieutenant Suzuki. Killed himself climbing into tank when pistol hit against turret hatch." The interpreter, a Japanese-American sergeant from the Military Intelligence Service, translated Yamamoto's technical observations with growing amazement. The captured sergeant described 3 separate incidents within his own company, each involving accidental discharge during routine handling. More significantly, he revealed that Japanese troops had developed unofficial handling procedures specifically to avoid the Type 94's tendency to fire without trigger manipulation. Experienced soldiers Learn to grip the weapon only by its barrel and handle, never touching the frame sides where the exposed sear bar could be accidentally activated. Navy Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, captured from a submarine crew off Truk, provided even more damaging testimony about the weapon's reputation among Japanese forces. His submarine had carried Type 94 pistols as standard sidearms, and Tanaka described the terror these weapons inspired among crew members forced to work in confined spaces where accidental contact was inevitable. "My pistol discharged twice by accident," Tanaka explained, through halting English supplemented by gestures. "One time when I put on table too hard. Another time when shipmate pick up wrong way. After that I carry empty. No bullets, ever. Better to have useless weapon than weapon that kills me." The pattern emerging from interrogations matched perfectly with Morrison's mechanical analysis at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Japanese troops had been living with the Type 94's fatal flaw since its introduction, developing workaround procedures and informal safety protocols that their American captors were documenting with growing alarm. The weapon was not simply dangerous to unfamiliar users. It was consistently hazardous to anyone who handled it, regardless of training or experience. Back at Aberdeen, Morrison compiled his final statistical analysis based on 127 controlled tests and field reports from 16 Pacific Theater commands. The numbers were undeniable and terrifying in their consistency. 89 accidental discharges under standard handling conditions, 0 mechanical failures of the discharge mechanism itself, average pressure required for firing, 2.3 pounds, maximum safe handling time before accidental activation, approximately 47 seconds under normal examination conditions. Colonel Anderson reviewed Morrison's technical summary with the grim expression of a commander who understood the implications for ongoing Pacific operations. American forces were advancing across thousands of miles of Japanese-held territory, capturing equipment and supplies that included unknown quantities of Type 94 pistols. Every captured weapon represented a potential casualty among American troops who assumed foreign equipment would behave according to rational safety principles. "Captain Morrison," Anderson said, studying the mechanical diagrams that illustrated the weapon's fatal design flaw, "I need this information distributed to every unit in the Pacific Theater immediately. Our troops are facing an enemy weapon that's more dangerous to handle than it is to face in combat." Morrison had already prepared comprehensive handling guidelines based on his mechanical analysis and field reports. The key recommendations were simple but absolute. Never pick up Type 94 pistols by the frame sides, always assume the weapon is loaded and ready to fire, handle only by barrel and grip if examination is absolutely necessary, and preferably avoid contact entirely unless properly trained ordnance personnel were available. But Morrison understood that the real solution was even simpler and more effective. American soldiers needed to recognize the Type 94's distinctive appearance, its ugly bulbous receiver, and the telltale external sear bar that marked it as fundamentally different from other Japanese weapons. Recognition would enable avoidance, and avoidance would prevent casualties from a weapon that violated every principle of safe firearms design. The technical bulletin went out to Pacific Theater commands within 72 hours, complete with photographs, mechanical diagrams, and explicit warnings about handling procedures. For the first time in the war, American forces were being warned about an enemy weapon that was more dangerous to its users than to its targets, a pistol that killed through engineering negligence rather than tactical application. The January 1944 warning bulletin reached every major Pacific command simultaneously, transmitted through the Army's priority communication network with the urgent classification that indicated immediate operational significance. At forward bases from the Aleutians to Australia, Intelligence officers posted Morrison's technical drawings alongside photographs of the distinctive Type 94 pistol. Its ugly, bulbous receiver and exposed sear bar now circled in red ink with explicit warnings about handling procedures. The bulletin's message was unambiguous. This Japanese weapon presented significant safety hazards to American personnel and should be avoided except by trained ordnance specialists. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months, accidental discharge rates among American forces dropped by 87% as troops learned to identify and avoid the lethal pistol. Morrison's mechanical analysis had provided the critical information needed to prevent casualties, but the broader implications of his investigation were only beginning to emerge. The Type 94 represented something unprecedented in modern warfare, an enemy weapon more dangerous to its own users than to opposing forces. The validation Morrison had been seeking arrived in an unexpected form during the brutal assault on Saipan in June 1944. Among the thousands of Japanese documents captured during the island's conquest were internal Imperial Army reports that confirmed his worst fears about the weapon's design flaws. The papers, translated by military intelligence service linguists, revealed that Japanese military authorities had been fully aware of the Type 94's safety problems for years, but had continued production anyway. An internal report dated March 19, 1942, documented 342 accidental discharges among Japanese troops between 1940 and 1942. The statistics were remarkably similar to Morrison's experimental results. Average discharge pressure of 2.8 pounds, consistent failure rates during routine handling, predictable wounds among personnel forced to carry the weapon. Most disturbing was the report's recommendation section, which called for immediate design modifications or complete replacement of the Type 94 with safer alternatives. Instead, Japan had continued manufacturing the defective pistol through the war's end, producing weapons they knew were killing their own soldiers. The captured documents revealed production totals that exceeded 71,000 units, each one carrying the same fundamental flaw that Kijiro Nambu had recognized during the Aomitsu's original design process. Japanese military procurement had chosen cost savings over soldier safety, accepting predictable casualties as the price of mass-producing an inherently dangerous weapon. By September 1945, with Japan's surrender finalizing Allied victory in the Pacific, Morrison sat in his Aberdeen office reviewing the complete Type 94 evaluation file. 2 years of systematic testing had produced definitive proof of the weapon's mechanical failures, while battlefield reports had validated his laboratory findings under combat conditions. The final statistics told a story of engineering negligence that had endangered both Japanese and American troops throughout the war. Total specimens tested, 247. Accidental discharge rate under standard handling conditions, 91.4%. Minimum pressure required for firing, 2.3 pounds average. American casualties prevented by early warning distribution, estimated between 180 and 220 wounded or killed soldiers who might otherwise have fallen victim to the weapon's design flaws. Lieutenant Chen, now promoted to captain after 2 years of exemplary service, knocked on Morrison's door before entering with a visitor who would provide the final piece of the Type 94 puzzle. Behind Chen stood a middle-aged Japanese civilian in worn but clean clothes, flanked by 2 American intelligence officers who had escorted him from the prisoner processing center at Fort Slocum. The man's bearing suggested education and technical background, despite the obvious hardships of Japan's final war months. Captain Morrison, one of the intelligence officers explained, "This is Kenjiro Nambu, son of the late Kijiro Nambu. He's here as part of our technical intelligence program, and he's requested to examine your Type 94 analysis." Morrison rose and extended his hand to the younger Nambu, understanding immediately the significance of this meeting. Through an interpreter, he learned that Kinjiro had inherited his father's engineering notes and design documents, including materials that might explain the decision-making process that had produced such a fundamentally flawed weapon. For 2 hours, Morrison walked him through the complete technical analysis, mechanical diagrams, test results, field reports, and statistical summaries that documented the Type 94's consistent failures. Kinjiro Nambu examined Morrison's findings with the methodical attention of a trained engineer, comparing American test results against his father's original design calculations. His reaction shifted from professional interest to obvious distress as the full scope of the weapon's problems became clear. Finally, through the interpreter, he spoke the words that confirmed Morrison's deepest suspicions about the pistol's development. "My father knew the external sear placement was dangerous," Kinjiro said quietly. "His design. Notes contain explicit warnings about discharge risks during careless handling. But the Army demanded a compact weapon at minimal manufacturing cost. He chose to compromise safety for contract specifications." Morrison nodded with the grim satisfaction of an engineer whose hypothesis had been proven correct. The Type 94 had failed not because of inadequate technical knowledge or manufacturing limitations, but because its designer had deliberately chosen expedience over fundamental safety principles. Kinjiro Nambu possessed the skill to create safer alternatives, but had been pressured into accepting unacceptable risks by military procurement demands. The younger Nambu was quiet for several minutes, studying Morrison's mechanical drawings and comparing them against his father's original sketches. When he finally spoke again, his words carried the weight of inherited responsibility and professional shame. "In Japan, we have a saying, 'The sword that cuts its own master is no sword at all.' My father's Type 94 was no weapon at all." As the meeting concluded, Morrison reflected on the broader lessons the Type 94 had taught about engineering ethics, military procurement, and the human cost of compromising safety for other considerations. The pistol had become more than a failed weapon design. It had become a case study in what happened when technical excellence bowed to institutional pressure. Kinjiro Nambu's reputation as Japan's premier firearms designer had been built on precision and reliability, but the Type 94 would be his lasting legacy, a reminder that genius could produce disasters when safety became negotiable. The Type 94's influence extended far beyond its wartime service. Morrison's testing protocols became standard procedures for evaluating captured weapons throughout the Cold War. His safety bulletins established templates for warning military personnel about equipment hazards. Most importantly, his fundamental principle that weapons which endanger their users are tactically worthless became doctrine in American ordnance development, ensuring that future designs would prioritize operator safety alongside battlefield effectiveness.